I'm here today with Mike Lewis as part of Shalom's Thinktrepreneur series. Mike Lewis is the founder and CEO of When to Jump, a global community of people who have left one path to pursue a very different one. Before this, he worked at Bain Capital, which he left to chase his dream of playing professional squash. He has a BA from Dartmouth College, and When to Jump is a collection of case studies about making big changes in your career and your life, and it's his first book. The stories include people who are the founder of Humans of New York, the designer of the Lyft logo, and the founder of Bonobo, but there are also many other stories of ordinary people who are yearning to make a change in their professional life. Mike, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, when we talk about when to jump, what do we mean by jump?
Well, originally I thought it was a jump like mine, which was leaving one very different world for a completely different career and life. I grew up loving the sport of squash and having a desire to play professionally someday. I remember meeting a professional sportsman when I was 14 who told me about living on mountains in Brazil and playing in cities like Sydney and traveling through Asia. And I knew I wanted that, but I also knew there was a certain path in life you're supposed to follow. And so for me, I was at this point in my life 10 years later where I thought, I guess this is what a jump is, taking this big step, moving across the world. What was interesting is I started to collect more stories. I found that a jump to me is something different than a jump to you versus someone on the bus or someone down at the bar. And a jump really comes down to having agency over your life. The way I think of jumping is that you can have a side jump that you do outside of work. You can have lifestyle jumps that change how you eat or how you exercise. You can have a career jump. You can even have jumps that are inside a company, like internal jumps that move you from sales into marketing or finance into operations. And so as we've built this community, which is now 5 years later, having had the idea in January 2013 to where we are today, with thousands of stories coming into whentojump.com and 44 stories now in my book, what you see is that a jump just means something different to everyone, but it comes down to that critical piece of having control over the choices you make.
In the book, you talk about the kind of planning that needs to go into jumping. But before you made your jump, you did your own kind of planning, which is that you talk to people. Why are other people's stories, and why were they an important part of your planning, and why are they inspiring to us?
Well, I think stories are such a powerful part of how we learn, because if we both read the first story in this book, which is about a karate school manager who jumped to become a screenwriter and had failed in several different ways and came from a middle-class Jewish background in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, for me, my life experiences will apply that in a different way than yours, and yet we'll still derive value from it. And so, if I was writing a book with 4 prescriptive things that you must do to change your life, it's very hard for both of us to get value out of that because we come from different angles. Instead, what we've done is found 44 stories from our community of thousands and threaded through 4 very common digestible themes that we can take away a broad set of takeaways from and insights from. But by looking at other stories, we're able to apply that to our own set of circumstances. And that's what's so beautiful about a story, is that I'll think about it differently because of my own life's circumstance than you will, and we'll learn differently because of that.
How important is timing when it comes to making a jump?
So I was very lucky. When I jumped, I didn't have a family and a mortgage to consider and things like that. But what you'll find in our community on whentojump.com, and we have a podcast every Tuesday that comes out sharing stories of mothers, retirees, single parents, immigrants, first-generation students, dropouts. Everyone has a set of circumstances that makes jumping difficult, but also doable at some point in time. And so for me, I spent nearly 2 years planning my jump. If you look in this book, we have nearly 50 people who have spent more than that or less than that, but some time preparing to jump. And so I believe we're on a spectrum. And if you look at the book, it's called the jump curve. Everyone should be on some point of that curve. For some, it might mean they're ready to jump in the next 2 months. For others, it might mean that that's years away, but that doesn't mean you can't get ready to jump and be planning your jump. So if you've got a mortgage lined up or student debts to pay back, the odds are tomorrow might not be the time to jump. But that doesn't stop you from planning and preparing, and that's what any successful jump entails.
Risk. Obviously, risk is risky, and jumping isn't for everyone. We can't really talk about taking these risks without talking about failure. When you interviewed the people in your book and in the years that you've been working on this kind of idea, how does failure factor into this? Did people fail at their dreams and go again? Did they try and find a way to not look back? How important is is being realistic about failure when you're making a big career change?
Well, that's probably the biggest question that I get around the book is, are these stories that are just success stories? And I feel like that would be a pretty lame book because it's only easy to look at a jump when it quote unquote works. But what I found most powerful in this book, but also in my own jump, when I was preparing to leave a job that was my dream job, that minted my resume and CV, when I was preparing to leave that role in venture capital, the most ardent supporters of my jump, the biggest cheerleaders and loudest advocates, were actually the people who jumped and it didn't work out the way they thought. And now when you look at the book and this fourth and final piece of our framework, it's called Don't Look Back. And those are the jumps where it didn't exactly work as planned. They're still figuring it out. It might be TBD in nature. And I think that's the most important lesson from this, is that when you go through this framework that we've put together in the book and you plan your jump, the outcome is actually less important because it's worth doing if you've put in that time. And no one that I've come across in our global community, on our When to Jump podcast, in the book, has regretted jumping if they followed this framework.
How much does personality play a role in the decision to jump?
Well, I think in some ways, everyone is so different. Like I said, we have an immigrant from El Salvador who just finished high school and that was it. His jump was from a middle skilled position in a warehouse. Very different personality than a woman in her late 60s who worked at a Holocaust education center in Miami and jumped into becoming a writer and a teacher. Those are different personalities, and yet I think the same thread that brings them together, along with the other stories in my book, is this idea of not wanting to regret never having tried, of fearing this idea that you'll live your life wondering what could have been. So the one trait that I see is this sentiment that says, no matter how scary my jump is, it's worth trying, and it's not nearly as terrifying as never having tried at all.
Do you think it's true that millennials will take bigger risks in their professional lives than other generations?
I believe that is something that we grapple with today as a millennial and as someone that's early on in his career. I feel like the way that the world approaches work is changing. I believe there was a study that said we'll have 7 or 8 careers before we retire. That's very different than the generation before ours, and certainly the generation before that, which went through the Great Depression. And in many ways, success was one career, one job, get the golden watch and retire. I think millennials today will see that the way we approach work and the future of work is just rapidly changing through technology and social innovation. And I think you'll not only want to jump, but you'll need to jump. Or have to jump as technology changes the way we think and work and automates certain jobs and industries. And I don't think that jobs will go away, but they will change, and that will require the need to jump.
There are a lot of amazing stories in the book. Is there one that you could talk about for a moment that really stands out for you, which sort of encapsulates a lot of the ideas that you've been talking about?
Well, it's tough because it's like choosing your favorite child. I think all of these stories mean something different to me and those who read them. That's what makes them unique stories. But I think that one that stands out would have to be from the Humans of New York founder and creator, Brandon Stanton. It's the final story in the book. And he's also, a young professional. He moved to New York and he started taking photographs well before he became well known. And what he says, which I think is so important for people to realize, and is the theme of your conference coming up, is that most of the work you do will come before anyone pays attention. And that passion wears off 2 weeks into doing what you love. The rest of that time is hard work, it's failures, it's restarts. And again, if you go to whentojump.com, if you drop your email in our newsletter, every month we share stories of that sentiment, of those what I call 10,000 unsexy steps that come with doing what you love. And I think Brandon's story is one of many that illustrate, yes, it's worth doing what you love, it will be difficult, but you're not alone and it will be worth doing it.
One thing that sets, I think, your book and your organization apart from others is that you aren't just thinking about these ideas and writing about these ideas, you've also put your money where your mouth is, so to speak. Can you talk a bit about what your jump was? You mentioned it before.
Yeah, absolutely. So my first jump was leaving Bain Capital, which was a global private equity and venture capital firm, and it was to play professional squash. I had planned 2 months, I jumped, and 2 months turned into 5 months, turned into 200,000 miles, nearly 2 years, and 50-something countries. A friend of mine at work named Corey Griffin, was with me when I sketched a cover page to what would become my second jump well before I left Bain Capital. So it was 5 years ago, and it was 2 years before I would take the jump into squash. And I talked to a woman who left Wall Street to become a cyclist. And I'd read her article that was on my desk that evening, and I cold called her. And what we talked about had nothing to do with being a cyclist. Instead, she talked about the tough conversations with her parents, the failures, the restarts. And I sketched a cover page to what I believed would be this book, but also would be the underpinnings to a community and a global platform where we would have media and events and we'd bring people together. It would be a community based on the desire to chase your dream and do something different. And so while I was playing, sadly my friend Corey passed away, and I decided to dedicate this book to him, but also to really become entrenched in starting this community. So today, my second jump was leaving the professional squash tour and starting whentojump.com, starting media partnerships with places like HuffPost. We have a podcast that comes out every Tuesday all around the world. We have a newsletter monthly, like I said, and we have a festival called Jump Club, where we hold once a year somewhere in the world. This year it'll be London, hopefully next year will be Sydney, and we're gonna bring together people that talk about what it means to jump into music, fashion, business, technology, and food. And for us, it's about championing this message through the website, through this book, and through our in-person experiences.
Mike, thanks very much.
Thanks for having me.